Good evening all and welcome back to Mr. Sill Chapter. Tonight we are peeling back the facade of small-town safety with 10 most disturbing true small-town horror stories. These bone-chilling accounts come directly from residents of quiet communities across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, who discovered that the most terrifying monsters often hide behind familiar faces and trusted institutions. Each story has been carefully verified through police reports, newspaper archives, and first-hand testimonies from people who lived through absolute nightmares in places where everyone knows your name. These are not folklore or legend, but documented events that shattered entire communities and left survivors questioning everything they thought they knew about their neighbors. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Mr. Sill Chapter for daily true horror content that exposes the darkness lurking in plain sight. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the secrets that small towns desperately want to keep buried. Now let us venture into these seemingly peaceful communities where white picket fences hide unspeakable horrors and where the person next door might be your worst nightmare. I have been playing the organ at St. Bartholomew's Church in Whitmore Valley for nearly 15 years. When you live in a village of barely 400 souls tucked away in the Yorkshire Dales, the church becomes more than just a place of worship. It is the heartbeat of the community, the place where baptisms, weddings, and funerals mark the passages of our lives. Pastor Edmund Thornfield had been our spiritual shepherd for over 2 decades, and there was not a person in Whitmore Valley who did not regard him as a pillar of moral authority. That is what made what happened on that gray October morning so utterly devastating. I remember the date precisely because it was the Sunday before Halloween, October 26, 2019. The morning had started like any other. I arrived at the church an hour before service to warm up the old pipe organ and review the hymns. The autumn light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting those familiar jeweled patterns across the wooden pews that I had seen thousands of times before. Mrs. Peaton was arranging flowers near the altar, humming softly to herself as she always did. Young Timothy Harwick was lighting the candles, his face serious with the responsibility Pastor Thornfield had given him. Everything was perfectly, wonderfully ordinary. The congregation began filing in around 10. I nodded to the familiar faces as I played the prelude. There was old Mr. Blackwood with his walking stick, the Morrison family with their 3 children fidgeting in their Sunday best, and Mrs. Davies clutching her worn prayer book. Nearly 60 people filled our modest church that morning, which was typical for Whitmore Valley. We were a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so we thought. Pastor Thornfield emerged from the vest at exactly 11:10, as punctual as always. He was a tall, dignified man in his late 50s with silver hair and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His sermon style was gentle but compelling, and even the most restless children seemed to settle when he spoke. I had played organ for his services for so many years that I could predict his every gesture, every pause for emphasis. But something was different that morning. As I transitioned from the opening hymn to the call to worship, I noticed Pastor Thornfield standing rigidly behind the pulpit, his hands gripping the wooden edges so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His usual warm smile was absent, replaced by an expression I had never seen before. There was something haunted in his eyes, something desperate. The congregation settled into their seats, prayer books rustling, children whispering. Mrs. Morrison shushed her youngest daughter, the normal sounds of worship beginning. Pastor Thornfield cleared his throat, but instead of his usual welcoming words, he stood in complete silence for what felt like an eternity. The congregation began to shift uncomfortably. I caught Mrs. Peaton's worried glance and gave a slight shrug, indicating I had no idea what was happening. Finally, Pastor Thornfield spoke, but his voice was different, strained, barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger with each word. "My dear congregation," he began, "I stand before you today not as your spiritual guide, but as a man who can no longer bear the weight of his sins." A murmur rippled through the church. This was not how our Sunday services typically began. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. For 23 years, I've stood in this pulpit and spoken to you of forgiveness, of redemption, of the power of confession to cleanse the soul. His voice was gaining strength now, but there was something terrible in it. "I have counseled you through your darkest moments, held your hands during times of grief, and celebrated your joys. You have trusted me with your secrets, your fears, your children." The word children seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Several parents instinctively pulled their little ones closer. "But I have been living a lie," Pastor Thornfield continued, his eyes now scanning the congregation with an intensity that made people squirm in their seats. "A monstrous lie that has poisoned every prayer I have uttered, every blessing I have given, every sacred ritual I have performed." Mrs. Davies dropped her prayer book. The sound echoed through the silent church like a gunshot. I stopped playing completely, my hands frozen above the keys. Whatever was happening, this was no ordinary sermon. 18 months ago, Pastor Thornfield's voice cracked. "I took the life of Sarah Mitchell." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children seemed to sense that something profound and terrible was occurring. Sarah Mitchell had been a 24-year-old teacher at our local primary school. She'd gone missing in March of the previous year during a hiking trip in the nearby moors. Despite extensive searches involving police, volunteers, and mountain rescue teams, her body had never been found. The official conclusion was that she had suffered an accident and fallen into one of the many hidden ravines that scarred the landscape. "She came to me," Pastor Thornfield continued, his voice now steady with a horrible calm, asking questions about the church finances. She had noticed irregularities in our charitable donations, discrepancies in our accounts. Sarah was always too clever, too observant for her own good. She threatened to contact the authorities about what she had discovered. My hands were shaking around me. I could hear sharp intakes of breath, muffled sobs beginning to emerge from the congregation, but no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if we were all paralyzed by the magnitude of what we were hearing. "I had been embezzling from the church for 5 years," he said. "Small amounts at first, then larger sums. I told myself it was temporary, that I would repay every penny. My wife's medical treatments were so expensive, and the insurance would not cover the experimental therapy she needed. I convinced myself that God would understand that I was saving the life of the woman I loved." Pastor Thornfield's wife had died of cancer 3 years earlier. The entire village had mourned with him, had brought casseroles and flowers, had held his hands during the funeral service. But Sarah would not be deterred. She said she had a moral obligation to report what she had found. So I asked her to meet me at the old shepherd's hut on Blackmore Ridge. Told her we could discuss the matter privately, find a solution that would not destroy the church's reputation. I could see Mr. Mitchell, Sarah's father, slowly rising from his seat in the third pew. His face was ashen, his lips moving soundlessly. "I never intended to hurt her," Pastor Thornfield said. And for the first time, his voice broke completely. "I only meant to convince her to give me time to make things right. But she was so determined, so righteous in her conviction. She said she would call the police that very evening. And I struck her just once, but it was enough." She fell and hit her head on the stone foundation of the hut. Mrs. Mitchell let out a wail that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Her husband caught her as she collapsed, and several people rushed to help them. I buried her in the peat bog behind the hut. Pastor Thornfield continued, seemingly oblivious to the chaos erupting in the congregation. I weighted her body with stones from the old wall and let the bog claim her. Then I came back here and led a prayer service for her safe return. People were standing now, shouting, crying, moving toward the exits. But Pastor Thornfield raised his voice above the commotion. For 18 months I have delivered sermons about God's mercy while her body decomposed in that unholy grave. I have comforted her parents while knowing exactly where their daughter lay. I have blessed this community while carrying the stain of murder on my soul. Mr. Mitchell broke free from those trying to restrain him and lunged toward the pulpit, but several of the younger men, including my own son David, held him back. "Why?" Mr. Mitchell screamed. "Why are you telling us this now?" Pastor Thornfield looked directly at him, and I saw something I will never forget in those eyes that had once seemed so kind and trustworthy. There was relief there, yes, but also something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Because I am dying," he said simply. "The same cancer that took my beloved Margaret has taken root in my body. I have perhaps 6 weeks to live, and I cannot meet my Maker with this secret burning in my chest. I needed you all to know the truth about the man you have revered, the monster you have welcomed into your homes and hearts." The next few minutes were chaos. Someone had called the police on their mobile phone. Mrs. Morrison was shepherding children out of the church while shielding their eyes. Mr. Mitchell was sobbing inconsolably while his neighbors tried to support him. And through it all, Pastor Thornfield stood calmly behind the pulpit, waiting. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, he went with them without resistance. He led them directly to Sarah's remains, which were exactly where he said they would be. The aftermath tore our community apart in ways I am still trying to understand. The church closed for 3 months while investigators searched every inch of the building and grounds. Many families left Whitmore Valley entirely, unable to reconcile their memories of Pastor Thornfield's kindness with the horrible truth of what he had done. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came weeks later when the police completed their investigation of the church finances. Pastor Thornfield had embezzled over $40,000, but not for his wife's medical treatment, as he had claimed. Margaret Thornfield had died with full insurance coverage. The money had been used to pay for gambling debts that Pastor Thornfield had accumulated over years of online betting. Even his confession had been a lie, a final manipulation designed to paint himself as a tragic figure driven by love rather than the selfish, violent man he truly was. I still play organ, but not at St. Bartholomew. The church remains closed, slowly falling into decay as ivy creeps up its stone walls, and rain seeps through its ancient roof. Sometimes on gray October mornings like the one when our world changed forever, I drive past the building and remember how safe we all felt in those pews, how completely we trusted the man in the pulpit. That trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. And sometimes late at night when the wind howls across the Yorkshire dales, I wonder what other secrets our quiet little village still holds. What other monsters might be hiding behind familiar smiles and Sunday morning prayers. As a rural mail carrier, I knew every face in Elkwood Township. After 12 years driving the same route through the Saskatchewan prairies, I could tell you which farmer took his coffee black, whose dog would chase my truck for exactly half a mile before giving up, and which elderly widow always had fresh biscuits waiting on her porch table. So when I started finding mailboxes overflowing and doors left wide open, I knew something was terribly wrong. It began on a crisp Monday morning in early September 2022. The harvest season was just getting underway, and the golden wheat fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon under a brilliant blue sky. I had loaded my truck with the usual mix of government checks, farm supply catalogs, and personal letters that connected these isolated homesteads to the outside world. My route covered 87 mi of gravel roads and farm lanes, serving 43 families scattered across an area roughly the size of Prince Edward Island. Most of these families had lived on their land for generations, their roots running as deep as the prairie grass. These were not people who simply packed up and left without telling anyone. The first sign, something was amiss, came at the Kowalski place about 15 mir northeast of town. Frank Kowalski was a third-generation wheat farmer who never missed an opportunity to chat about the weather or complain about grain prices. His mailbox was crammed so full that letters had started spilling onto the ground. When I knocked on his door, there was no answer. His pickup truck was gone, but that was not unusual during harvest time. At the next farm, the Hendersons had the same problem. Mailbox overflowing, house empty, no signs of recent activity. Margaret Henderson was a retired school teacher who always made sure to thank me personally when I delivered her pension check. She had not collected her mail in over a week. By noon, I had visited 12 farms. Every single one was deserted. The mailboxes told a story of sudden abandonment. Some were stuffed with important documents that no farmer would ever leave uncollected during harvest season. Insurance notices, bank statements, checks from grain buyers. At the Morrison farm, I found their weekly grocery order from the co-op still sitting on the porch where the delivery truck had left it 3 days earlier. The milk had spoiled and flies buzzed around rotting produce. I tried calling my supervisor from the truck's radio but got only static. Cell phone coverage was spotty out here on the best of days, and today I could not get a signal anywhere. The isolation I usually enjoyed about my job suddenly felt oppressive. At the Petro farm, I found the first truly disturbing evidence. The front door was standing wide open, swaying gently in the prairie wind. When I called out and got no response, I stepped inside. The kitchen table was set for lunch with sandwiches still sitting on plates, but the bread was rock hard and covered in mold. A pot of coffee sat cold on the stove, a thick skin of mold floating on its surface. In the living room, the television was still on, playing static from a channel that had gone off the air. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, showing 3 generations of Petrovs who had worked this land. But there was something wrong with the photos. In every single picture, the faces had been carefully scratched out with what looked like a pen or nail. I backed out of the house and ran to my truck, my heart hammering against my ribs. The pattern continued at every farm. Doors open, meals abandoned, signs of sudden departure, but no indication of where anyone had gone or why. At the Schmidt place, I found children's toys scattered in the yard as if dropped mid-play. A tricycle lay on its side near the barn, one wheel still spinning slowly in the breeze. By late afternoon, I had completed my entire route without delivering a single piece of mail. 43 farms, all empty, not a soul to be found across nearly 100 square miles of prairie. I drove back to Elkwood as fast as I dared on the gravel roads. Dust blooms billowing behind my truck. The town itself seemed normal enough. Cars moved down Main Street, people walked in and out of shops. The grain elevator was busy with harvest traffic. But when I asked about the missing farm families, I got strange reactions. At the post office, my supervisor, Jim Carlson, listened to my report with a puzzled expression. "What families?" he asked. "Dakota, there are no farms out on that route. That land has been empty for years." I stared at him in disbelief. "Jim, I've been delivering mail to those people for 12 years. Frank Kowalski, the Hendersons, the Petrovs. You know these families?" Jim shook his head slowly. "Son, I think you need to take a few days off. The heat might be getting to you. That whole area was bought up by AgriCorp 5 years ago. They bulldozed the old homesteads and turned it all into one big industrial farm. There has not been anyone living out there since then." But I knew what I had seen. I drove to the RCMP detachment and tried to file a missing persons report, but Constable Morrison just looked at me like I was having some kind of breakdown. He pulled out a large map of the area and pointed to my route. "See this shaded area?" He said, "That is all AgriCorp land now, industrial agriculture, no homesteads, no families, has not been for years." That evening I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of beer and tried to make sense of what was happening. I pulled out my route book, the one I used to track deliveries and note special instructions. Every page that should have contained information about the farm families was blank, completely blank, as if nothing had ever been written there. But I knew those people. I remembered their faces, their voices, their stories. Frank Kowalski telling me about his grandfather homesteading the land in 1902. Margaret Henderson showing me photos of her former students. The Petro children running out to greet my truck every Friday when their comic books arrived. The next morning I drove the route again, this time with a camera. I was determined to document what I found. But when I reached the area where the farm should have been, I found only vast fields of wheat stretching to the horizon. No houses, no barns, no mailboxes, no evidence that anyone had ever lived there at all. The land was completely flat and featureless, showing no signs that buildings had ever been demolished or removed. The wheat grew in perfect rows as if it had been planted decades ago. When I got out of my truck and walked into the field where the Kowalski house should have been, I found the soil underneath was different, darker, richer, as if it had been fertilized by something that had decomposed there long ago. I started making inquiries around town, trying to find someone who remembered the farm families. But everywhere I went, I got the same response. Those lands had been empty for years. No one had ever lived there. I was told I must be confused, maybe thinking of some other area. But late one night at the Wheat Chief Tavern, an elderly man named Bill Henderson approached my table. He was drunk and looked around nervously before sitting down. "You are asking about the families out on Township Road 47. He whispered. "My grandfather used to tell stories about that area. Said there was a settlement there in the early 1900s, good farming families. But one harvest season they all just vanished. Every last one of them. Houses left empty, crops left to rot in the fields." Bill leaned closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Grandfather said the government came through and plowed everything under. Claimed there never was a settlement there, but he remembered. Said on quiet nights you could still hear the sound of children playing in those fields. Said the land was cursed." He finished his drink and stood up unsteadily. "Maybe you are just seeing what used to be there, son. Maybe some places hold on to their ghosts longer than others." I tried to press him for more information, but Bill hurried away, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone had heard our conversation. That was 6 months ago. I still drive mail routes for Canada Post, but they transferred me to a different area after I kept insisting on investigating Township Road 47. My new route is busy suburbs around Saskatchewan, safe, normal, boring. But sometimes on quiet Sunday afternoons I drive back to that stretch of prairie. The wheat fields are still there, endless and golden under the Saskatchewan sky. And sometimes, if I listen carefully, I can hear faint voices carried on the wind. The sound of Frank Kowalski complaining about grain prices. Margaret Henderson calling her cats in for supper. Children laughing as they chase each other around a farmyard that no longer exists. I keep their mail in a box in my basement, all. Those undelivered letters, bills, and packages addressed to people who apparently never existed. Sometimes I think about burning it all, but somehow that feels like erasing the last proof that they were ever real. The wheat grows thick and golden out there now, fed by soil that remembers what the rest of the world has forgotten. And somewhere beneath those endless fields, 43 families are still waiting for their mail to be delivered. I thought working the night shift at Millbrook General Hospital would be peaceful. After 5 years of chaotic day shifts in Boston emergency rooms, the prospect of quiet hallways and time to catch up on paperwork seemed like a blessing. Millbrook was a small Vermont town of barely 3,000 people nestled in a valley between rolling green hills. The hospital itself was built in 1936, a 3-story brick building that served the entire county. At night, with only a skeleton crew and maybe a dozen patients, it felt more like a rest home than a medical facility. I was dead wrong about the peaceful part. My first week went smoothly enough. The night charge nurse, Patricia Winters, was a 30-year veteran who knew every creaking floorboard and temperamental machine in the building. She showed me the routines, introduced me to the small night staff, and warned me about the quirks of working in such an old facility. "The elevators get stuck between the second and third floors sometimes," she told me as we made rounds on my second night. "And the heating system makes all kinds of noises. You will get used to it." What she did not mention were the voices. It started during my third week on a particularly quiet Tuesday night in October. I was stationed at the second-floor nurses' station when I heard what sounded like a patient calling for help. The voice was faint but urgent, coming from somewhere down the east wing. I checked the call board, but no lights were flashing. All the patient rooms showed green, indicating no active calls. I walked down the hallway to investigate, my soft-soled shoes silent on the polished linoleum. The voice seemed to be coming from room 237, but when I checked, the room was empty. It had been empty for weeks, according to the census board. The bed was stripped down to the mattress, and a thin layer of dust covered the bedside table. As I turned to leave, I heard the voice again, clearer this time. "Nurse, please, I need help." The voice was coming from inside the empty room. I stood in the doorway for a full minute listening, but heard only the hum of the ventilation system and the distant beeping of monitors from occupied rooms. When I mentioned it to Patricia during our shift change meeting, she just smiled knowingly. "Old buildings hold on to sounds sometimes," she said. "You will hear all kinds of things working nights here. Best to focus on the living patients." But the voices became more frequent, always at night, always from empty rooms or darkened hallways. Sometimes I would hear entire conversations, muffled, discussions between doctors and patients about treatments for conditions that were no longer seen in modern medicine. Once I distinctly heard a child crying in the pediatric ward, but when I checked, all the children were sleeping peacefully. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late October. I was working alone in the intensive care unit monitoring 2 post-surgical patients when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy, deliberate steps that echoed off the walls despite the sound-dampening tiles that had been installed years ago. I assumed it was Dr. Ricks making late rounds, but when I looked out, the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, moving away from the ICU toward the elevator bank. I followed the sound, but by the time I reached the elevators, the footsteps had stopped. Both elevator cars were on the ground floor according to the indicator lights. That was when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a medicinal odor that reminded me of old-fashioned antiseptics, the kind they stopped using decades ago because of safety concerns. But underneath that was something else, something organic and unpleasant. The smell of decay of flesh that had been left too long in the heat. I traced the odor to a supply closet at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual because supply closets were supposed to remain locked at all times. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me like a physical force, so strong that I had to cover my nose with my sleeve. The closet appeared normal at first glance. Shelves lined with medical supplies, boxes of gauze and syringes, bottles of saline solution. But in the back corner, barely visible in the dim light from the hallway, was something that should not have been there. It was a hospital bed, old and rusted, with restraints still attached to the railings. The mattress was stained with dark patches that could have been blood or could have been something worse. Lying on the bed was a figure covered by a sheet that had once been white but was now yellowed with age and spotted with brown stains. The figure was breathing. I could see the slow rise and fall of the chest. Could hear the wet, labored respirations of someone in severe respiratory distress. But when I pulled back the sheet, there was nothing there. Just an empty bed with stains that seemed to move and shift in the poor light. I stumbled backward out of the closet and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what I had seen or thought I had seen. When I opened the door again 30 seconds later, the closet was exactly as it should have been. No bed, no figure, no overwhelming smell of decay, just shelves of medical supplies and the faint scent of industrial disinfectant. I did not report the incident. How could I? Who would believe that I had seen a phantom patient in a supply closet? But I started keeping a journal documenting every strange occurrence, every unexplained sound or smell or sight. The entries multiplied quickly. October 29th, heard a code blue announcement over the intercom at 3:47 a.m. Rushed to room 314 as directed, but the room was empty. Night supervisor claims no code was called. November 3rd, found all the IV pumps on the 3rd floor set to maximum flow rate. No explanation for how this happened. Pumps have safety locks that require a key to adjust. November 8th, patient in room 221 complained that nurses kept coming into his room all night to check on him. Security cameras show no one entering or leaving his room after midnight. November 15th, discovered that someone had been accessing patient files from the 1940s and 1950s on the computer system. Files that were supposedly archived and unavailable for routine access. The pattern became clear when I started researching the hospital's history. Millbrook General had not always been the quiet community hospital it was today. From 1936 to 1952, it had housed a psychiatric ward on the 3rd floor. The ward had been closed after a scandal involving experimental treatments and patient deaths. According to newspaper archives I found at the town library, at least 47 patients had died in the psychiatric ward, many under suspicious circumstances. The ward had been converted to general medical use in the 1960s, but the records showed a troubling pattern. Over the years, numerous staff members had reported unexplained phenomena. Nurses quitting without notice, doctors requesting transfers, maintenance workers refusing to work alone in certain areas of the building. In 1987, a night nurse named Rebecca Torres had filed a formal complaint with the State Health Department claiming that the hospital was haunted and that patient safety was being compromised by supernatural activity. She was quietly transferred to another facility and her complaint was buried in bureaucratic paperwork. I tried to contact Rebecca Torres but learned that she had died in a car accident just 6 months after leaving Millbrook General. The accident had occurred on the mountain road leading away from town on a clear night with perfect driving conditions. Her car had apparently left the road and crashed into a tree, but investigators had never determined why. Armed with this information, I confronted Patricia Winters during a quiet moment on our shift. I told her everything I had experienced, everything I had discovered about the hospital's history. I expected her to dismiss my concerns or suggest I was suffering from stress-related hallucinations. Instead, she sat down heavily and looked at me with tired eyes. "I was wondering when you would start seeing them," she said quietly. "It usually takes about a month for new night staff to become sensitive to the activity. Some people never see anything at all. Others, like you, seem to attract their attention." Patricia went on to explain that the night staff had developed an informal protocol for dealing with what they euphemistically called historical residue. They avoided certain areas of the hospital between midnight and dawn. They never investigated unexplained sounds or voices. They kept their interactions with patients brief and professional because prolonged exposure to the hospital's atmosphere seemed to make the phenomena more intense. The important thing, Patricia said, is not to acknowledge them directly. Do not speak to the voices. Do not investigate the sounds. Do not try to help any patients you encounter who are not on the current census. The moment you engage with them, they become more real, more present. And once that happens, they do not want to let you go. I lasted another 2 weeks at Millbrook General. The phenomena became more intense, more personal. I would hear my name being called from empty rooms. I would find personal messages written on patient charts and handwriting that looked like my own. Photographs of me began appearing in places where I had never been photographed, showing me in rooms I had never entered with patients I had never treated. The final incident occurred on a Friday night in December. I was making rounds when I encountered a patient in room 237, the same room where I had first heard voices. The patient was an elderly woman in a hospital gown that looked decades out of date. She appeared to be in severe pain, reaching out to me with hands that were translucent in the dim light. "Please," she whispered, "help me." They said they were going to help me, but they hurt me instead. Please do not let them hurt me anymore. I knew I should follow Patricia's advice and ignore the apparition, but my training as a nurse kicked in. This was a patient in distress, real or not. I reached out to take her hand, to offer what comfort I could. The moment our skin made contact, the world around me changed. I was no longer in the modern Millbrook General Hospital. I was in the psychiatric ward as it had existed in the 1940s. The walls were a sickly green color, painting and stained with substances I did not want to identify. The smell of unwashed bodies and fear hung heavy in the air. Down the hallway, I could hear screaming, begging, the sound of metal restraints against metal bed frames. The elderly woman was no longer elderly. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with wild hair and eyes that darted around in terror. "They are coming back," she said. "The doctors with their machines and their needles. Please, you have to help me escape. You have to help all of us escape." I tried to pull my hand away, but her grip was surprisingly strong. Around us, other figures began to materialize. Patients in restraints, their faces bearing the marks of treatments that had been abandoned by modern medicine for good reason. They were all reaching toward me, all pleading for help. That was 7 decades too late. I finally managed to break free and ran for the stairs, but the hospital had become a maze. Hallways stretched impossibly long. Doors led to rooms that could not exist. And everywhere I turned, I encountered more patients from the psychiatric ward's dark past. I was trapped in that nightmare version of Millbrook General. For what felt like hours, though, when I finally emerged into the present-day hospital. Only 20 minutes had passed on the lobby clock. I found myself sitting in my car in the parking lot with no memory of how I had gotten there. My uniform was soaked with sweat and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove straight home, called in sick for the rest of my shifts, and submitted my resignation the following Monday. The hospital administration accepted it without question, and I got the impression they were almost relieved to see me go. 3 months later, I was working at a modern hospital in Burlington, trying to rebuild my confidence as a nurse. But sometimes, usually during night shifts, I would catch a glimpse of a figure in an outdated hospital gown standing at the end of a hallway. Or I would hear my name being called from an empty room. The patients from Millbrook General had not forgotten me, and I began to understand that they never would. I still live in Vermont, but I drive an extra hour to avoid passing through Millbrook. The hospital is still there, still serving the community, still staffed by brave nurses and doctors who work through the night. I hope they are stronger than I was. I hope they can resist the pull of the past that lives in those old walls. But sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I wonder if any of them have started hearing voices from empty rooms. and I wonder if they will be wise enough to ignore them. When my daughter started having nightmares about school, I demanded answers. What I discovered in the basement of Penn Primary made me pull her out immediately and question everything I thought I knew about the quiet Welsh village I had called home for 37 years. Penn is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, or so I thought. Nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling green hills dotted with sheep, our village of 800 souls had remained largely unchanged for decades. The primary school, a Victorian brick building with tall windows and a slate roof, had educated generations of local children, including myself and my wife Catherine back in the 1980s. My daughter Emily had always been a bright, cheerful child who loved school. She was 7 years old and in her second year at Penn Primary when the nightmares began. At first, they seemed like typical childhood fears. She would wake up crying, talking about dark rooms and scary voices. Catherine and I assumed it was just her imagination, perhaps triggered by a horror film she had glimpsed or a story older children had told her. But the nightmares became more specific, more detailed. Emily would describe being led downstairs that did not exist in the school into rooms filled with old desks and strange equipment. She talked about children who looked sad and scared, children who wore clothes from long ago. Most disturbing of all, she insisted that her teacher, Mrs. Griffiths, was involved in whatever was happening in these dream rooms. She takes us down there during story time. Emily told me one morning over breakfast, her young face pale and serious. But we are not supposed to tell our parents. She says it is our special secret. Catherine and I exchanged concerned glances. Mrs. Griffiths had been teaching at Penn Primary for over 20 years. She was a respected member of the community, known for her dedication to her students and her involvement in local charities. The idea that she would be taking children anywhere inappropriate seemed impossible. But Emily's distress was real and growing worse. She began refusing to go to school, claiming that her stomach hurt or that she felt sick. When we pressed her for details, she would only say that she did not want to go to the special room anymore. I decided to speak with the head tier, Mr. Rhys Davies, during the next parent consultation evening. Mr. Davies had been running Penn Primary for 15 years, and I had known him casually through village functions. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles who always spoke in measured, careful tones. When I mentioned Emily's nightmares and her reluctance to attend school, Mr. Davies listened politely but seemed unconcerned. Children often have vivid imaginations, he said, shuffling through Emily's academic records. Her work is excellent, and Mrs. Griffiths has nothing but praise for her behavior and participation. Perhaps the nightmares are related to something at home. Changes in routine can sometimes affect young children in unexpected ways. His dismissive tone irritated me, but I tried to remain diplomatic. Emily specifically mentions being taken downstairs during school time. Are there any basement rooms or lower levels that classes might visit? Mr. Davies paused, his pen hovering over a form he had been completing. The school does have some storage areas below ground level, but they are not used for educational purposes. Children would have no reason to visit those areas. He looked up at me with what seemed like genuine concern. Mr. Clark, if Emily is having difficulties adjusting to school, I would be happy to arrange for her to speak with our educational psychologist. Sometimes these issues can be resolved with professional guidance. I left the meeting unsatisfied but unsure how to proceed. That evening, I found a note tucked under the windscreen wiper of my car. It was written on yellowed paper in careful handwriting. Some secrets are kept for good reasons. Do not dig where you are not welcome. The note made my blood run cold. Someone was watching me. Someone who knew about my concerns regarding the school. I showed the note to Catherine, who suggested we contact the police. But what could we report? A vague warning note in a 7-year-old's nightmares hardly constituted evidence of wrongdoing. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to the school and its routines. I volunteered to help with the autumn fair preparations, which gave me an excuse to spend time in the building during school hours. The school seemed perfectly normal. Children laughing in playgrounds, teachers leading lessons. The usual controlled chaos of primary education. But I noticed things that had not registered before. Certain areas of the building were always kept locked, including a heavy wooden door at the end of a corridor near the old gymnasium. When I asked Mrs. Griffiths about it during a casual conversation, she explained that it led to unused storage areas and was kept locked for safety reasons. "You know how curious children can be," she said with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "We cannot have them wandering into potentially dangerous areas." That weekend, I did something I am not proud of. I returned to the school after dark using a spare key I had borrowed from the caretaker's office during my volunteer work. I told myself I was just being a concerned parent, trying to put Emily's fears to rest by proving that nothing sinister was happening in the school building. The corridors were eerily quiet in the darkness, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows on the walls. I made my way to the locked door I had noticed earlier. Using a screwdriver from my car, I managed to work the old lock open. Behind the door was a staircase leading downward, just as Emily had described in her nightmares. The air was stale and carried an unpleasant odor that reminded me of old hospitals or laboratories. Battery-powered emergency lights provided minimal illumination as I descended into what appeared to be a basement level I had never known existed. The basement was larger than I had expected, with several rooms connected by narrow corridors. The first room I entered contained old school furniture, desks, chairs, and blackboards that looked like they dated back decades. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, suggesting the space had not been used in years. But the second room made my stomach lurch. It was set up like a classroom, but wrong somehow. The desks were arranged in precise rows, each equipped with restraints that had been bolted to the furniture. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and medical equipment that seemed completely out of place in a school setting. Charts showing human anatomy hung alongside psychological evaluation forms and what appeared to be medication dosage guidelines. On one of the desks, I found a manila folder containing photographs and documents. The photographs showed children, local children I recognized from old school yearbooks, sitting at the restrained desks with vacant expressions. The documents were clinical reports describing various behavioral modification techniques and educational interventions that sounded more like psychological experiments than teaching methods. One report, dated 1987, described a program called Project Harmony that was designed to optimize student compliance and academic performance through controlled environmental stimuli and pharmaceutical assistance. The report was signed by Mr. Davies, though it indicated he had been involved with the school for far longer than the 15 years I had believed. As I read through more documents, a horrifying picture emerged. For decades, selected children from Penn Primary had been subjected to psychological and medical experiments under the guise of special educational programs. The experiments ranged from sensory deprivation and behavioral conditioning to the administration of unlicensed psychiatric medications. The program had apparently been funded by government research grants and supported by local education authorities who had covered up any evidence of wrongdoing. Children who showed signs of resistance or who threatened to expose the program had been transferred to other institutions or had simply disappeared from school records entirely. Emily's name appeared on a list of potential subjects for the current year. I was photographing documents with my phone when I heard footsteps on the stairs above. Panic flooded my system as I realized someone had discovered my unauthorized entry. I quickly stuffed the most damning documents into my jacket and looked for another way out of the basement. I found a second staircase that led to an exit behind the school building. As I emerged into the cold night air, I could see lights coming on in the main building and hear voices echoing through the corridors. I had managed to escape detection, but I knew my investigation had been discovered. Over the next several days, I was subjected to a campaign of intimidation that confirmed my worst fears. Anonymous phone calls threatened harm to my family if I continued interfering in matters beyond my understanding. My car tires were slashed and our house was broken into while we were away, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Most disturbing of all, Emily's behavior at school changed dramatically. According to Mrs. Griffiths, she had become withdrawn and uncooperative, refusing to participate in class activities and spending most of her time staring out the window. When I asked Emily about her experiences, she claimed she could not remember anything about school and insisted that her previous nightmares had been silly dreams. The change in Emily's personality was so dramatic that Catherine and I became convinced she had been subjected to some form of psychological manipulation or medication. We immediately withdrew her from Penn Primary, citing family reasons, and enrolled her in a school in the neighboring town of Lundo. I took the documents and photographs I had gathered to the police, but my report was met with skepticism and delay tactics. The detective assigned to investigate claimed that the evidence was circumstantial and that breaking into the school building had potentially compromised any legal case. After weeks of bureaucratic runarounds, I was informed that the investigation had been suspended due to lack of credible evidence. Frustrated by official inaction, I contacted a journalist at the BBC who specialized in investigative reporting. Initially interested in the story, she later called to inform me that her editors had decided not to pursue the investigation, citing concerns about unsubstantiated allegations against respected community members. It became clear that the conspiracy I had uncovered reached far beyond Penn Primary. The program had been protected by people in positions of authority who had significant power to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. But I refused to give up. I created copies of all the documents and photographs, storing them in multiple locations. I reached out to other parents whose children had attended the school over the years, carefully probing for any memories of unusual experiences or behavioral changes. While most were reluctant to discuss their concerns openly, several confirmed that their children had exhibited symptoms similar to Emily's. Through persistent research, I discovered that similar programs had operated at schools across Wales during the 1980s and 1990s, often funded by pharmaceutical companies testing new psychiatric medications on children. The programs had been quietly discontinued after several scandals involving child deaths and permanent psychological damage, but many of the people involved had simply moved to other positions within the education system. The breakthrough came when I located Dr. Margaret Hughes, a former researcher who had worked on Project Harmony before, developing a conscience and attempting to expose the program. Dr. Hughes, now in her 70s and suffering from early-stage dementia, had kept detailed records of her work, including evidence of government approval for the experiments and documentation of the long-term harm inflicted on participating children with Dr. Hughes's evidence. I was finally able to interest a national newspaper in the story. The investigation that followed revealed that Project Harmony had affected over 200 children across 12 schools in Wales. Many of the victims had suffered permanent psychological damage, and at least 8 children had died from complications related to experimental medications. The scandal led to criminal charges against several educators and researchers, including Mr. Davies, who was sentenced to 12 years in prison for child abuse and conspiracy. Mrs. Griffiths received a lighter sentence in exchange for her cooperation with investigators, though she maintained she had been following orders from superiors and had not fully understood the nature of the program. Penn Primary was closed permanently, and the building now stands empty, its windows boarded up and its playground overgrown with weeds. The village has never fully recovered from the revelation that one of its most trusted institutions had been hiding such dark secrets for so many years. Emily gradually recovered from her experiences, though she required years of therapy to overcome the psychological trauma she had endured. She is now a healthy, happy teenager who excels in school and shows no lasting effects from the abuse she suffered. But Catherine and I know that we came very close to losing her to a system that viewed children as expendable test subjects. The official investigation concluded that Project Harmony had been an isolated incident perpetrated by a small group of rogue educators and researchers. But I know better. The systematic nature of the cover-up, the involvement of multiple institutions, and the ease with which evidence was initially suppressed suggests that this was just one part of a much larger program of experimentation on vulnerable children. Sometimes late at night, I wonder how many other schools across the country are hiding similar secrets in their basement. And I wonder how many parents like myself have dismissed their children's nightmares as mere imagination when they were actually cries for help that went unheeded for far too long. I came back to visit my childhood home after 15 years. Cedar Falls was supposed to have 800 residents. I could not find a single living soul. The drive up Highway 99 from Vancouver should have taken me 4 hours, but I found myself taking the scenic route through the Fraser Valley, postponing what I knew would be an emotional homecoming. I had not been back to Cedar Falls since I left for university in 2009, despite my mother's constant invitations and my father's gentle guilt trips during our weekly phone calls. But now both my parents were gone, killed in a car accident 3 months earlier on a rain-slick mountain road just outside town. The lawyers handling their estate had been pressing me to return and deal with the family property. A modest 2-story house on Maple Street where I had spent the first 18 years of my life. Cedar Falls had always been the kind of place you either loved or could not wait to escape. Nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ranges about 300 kilometers northeast of Vancouver, it was a logging town that had somehow survived the industry downturns that had killed so many similar communities across British Columbia. The population had held steady at around 800 people for as long as anyone could remember, sustained by a small sawmill, a few tourist lodges, and the stubborn determination of families who had called the valley home for generations. As I crested the final hill before descending into the valley, I felt the familiar mix of nostalgia and claustrophobia that Cedar Falls had always inspired in me. The town spread out below looked exactly as I remembered it. A cluster of houses and buildings arranged around the single main street, surrounded by dense forest that stretched to the horizon in every direction. But something was wrong. There was no smoke rising from any of the chimneys, despite the October chill that made my breath visible in the late afternoon air. No cars moved along the streets. No lights showed in any of the windows, even though dusk was settling over the valley. I drove down the winding mountain road and onto Main Street, my rental car's engine the only sound echoing off the empty buildings. The silence was absolute and unnerving. Even in the quietest moments of my childhood, there had always been some sign of life. A dog barking, a screen door slamming, the distant sound of machinery from the sawmill. Now there was nothing. I parked in front of Mackenzie's general store where I had bought candy as a child and later worked part-time during high school. The store's windows were dark and a handwritten sign in the door read, "Gone fishing back soon," but the paper looked weathered and faded as if it had been there for months. I tried the door handle locked. Walking down Main Street, I peered into shop windows and tried doors, finding everything secured and abandoned. The post office, the hardware store, even the Copper Kettle Cafe where half the town gathered every morning for coffee and gossip. All empty, all locked, all showing signs of prolonged vacancy. At the end of Main Street stood the community center, a building that had served as everything from a movie theater to a polling station during my childhood. The parking lot was empty except for a few scattered leaves blowing in the mountain wind. Posted on the front door was a notice from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but the text was too faded to read clearly. My unease was growing into genuine fear. 800 people do not simply vanish without explanation. There should have been some sign of what had happened. Emergency vehicles, investigation equipment, at least some indication that authorities were aware of and responding to whatever had occurred. But there was nothing. The town sat in its mountain valley like a stage set after the actors had gone home. I drove to my parents' house on Maple Street, fishing the key from under the flower pot where my mother had always hidden it. The house smelled stale and dusty, but otherwise appeared exactly as I remembered from my last visit 5 years earlier. Family photos lined the mantelpiece. My mother's collection of ceramic owls watched from their perches on various shelves, and my father's reading glasses sat folded on the side table next to his favorite chair. Everything was normal except for the complete absence of life outside the windows. I tried calling the RCMP detachment in the nearest large town, but my cell phone showed no signal. The landline in the kitchen produced no dial tone when I picked up the receiver. Even the battery-powered radio in my father's workshop yielded only static when I turned it on and scanned through the frequencies. As darkness fell, the emptiness became even more oppressive. No porch lights came on automatically, no television screens flickered behind curtains. The entire town sat, in complete darkness except for my parents' house where I had turned on every light I could find in an attempt to push back the suffocating sense of isolation. I spent a sleepless night in my childhood bedroom, jumping at every creak and settling sound the old house made. Every hour or so, I would look out the window, hoping to see some sign of life. A car driving down the street, lights in a neighbor's window, anything to indicate that I was not completely alone. But the darkness remained absolute. The next morning, I began a systematic search of the town, going house by house and looking for any clue about what had happened to the residents. Most of the houses were locked, but I found several with doors standing open or windows that had been left unsecured. What I discovered inside was deeply disturbing. The houses showed clear signs of sudden abandonment. Meals sat half-finished on kitchen tables. Television sets were still tuned to channels that no longer broadcast, and personal belongings lay scattered, as if people had been interrupted in the middle of their daily routines and had simply walked away. In the Morrison house on Pine Street, I found a pot of soup still sitting on the stove, though it had long since evaporated to a black crust at the bottom of the pan. The calendar on the kitchen wall was turned to September 2024, just 1 month before my arrival. At the Henderson place, children's toys were scattered across the living room floor, and a half-completed jigsaw puzzle lay spread across the coffee table. The pieces that had been placed showed part of a mountain landscape that looked eerily similar to the view from Cedar Falls itself. The most unsettling discovery came at the Kowalski house near the edge of town. The front door was wide open, swaying slightly in the mountain breeze. Inside, I found evidence of a meal that had been interrupted mid-preparation. Vegetables sat chopped on a cutting board. A pot of water had boiled dry on the stove, and an open cookbook showed a recipe for beef stew. But in the living room, all the furniture had been pushed against the walls, leaving a large, empty space in the center of the room. On the hardwood floor, someone had drawn what appeared to be a complex geometric pattern in white chalk. Circles within circles connected by lines and symbols that I did not recognize. At the center of the pattern was a single word written in capital letters G-O-N-E. I took photographs with my phone, though I had no way to send them to anyone or upload them anywhere without a cellular signal. The pattern looked like something from an occult ritual, but that seemed impossible. The people of Cedar Falls had been pragmatic, down-to-earth folks, loggers and shop owners and retirees. not the types to get involved in anything mystical or supernatural. My search of the sawmill on the outskirts of town revealed more questions than answers. The facility appeared to have been shut down in an orderly fashion. Equipment properly secured, materials stored according to safety protocols, and all the paperwork filed neatly in the office. But there was no indication of when the shutdown had occurred or why. The employee parking lot contained about 30 vehicles, all covered with a light layer of dust and fallen leaves that suggested they had been sitting there for weeks. I tried several of the cars and found that most still had keys in the ignition, as if the drivers had parked and walked away without planning to return. By the third day of my stay in Cedar Falls, I was beginning to question my own sanity. The complete isolation, the eerie silence, and the mounting evidence that an entire community had simply vanished without explanation was taking a psychological toll that I had not anticipated. I started talking to myself just to hear a human voice, and I found myself checking the same houses over and over again, hoping to find some detail I had missed that might provide a rational explanation for what had happened. On the fourth morning, I made a discovery that changed everything. While searching through papers in the town hall, I found meeting minutes from the Cedar Falls Municipal Council dated September 15, 2024. Just 6 weeks before my arrival, the final item on the agenda was listed simply as the Blackwood Project Final Phase. I had never heard of any Blackwood project, but the meeting minutes indicated that it had been under discussion for several months. References were made to population relocation, controlled evacuation procedures, and government compensation packages. Most disturbing of all was a notation that all council members had signed confidentiality agreements regarding the project details. Further searching revealed a locked filing cabinet in the mayor's office. Using a crowbar from the hardware store, I forced it open and discovered files that painted a horrifying picture of what had happened to Cedar Falls. The Blackwood Project, according to the documents, had been a joint operation between the Canadian government and an unnamed private corporation. The project involved the testing of atmospheric manipulation technologies that required the complete evacuation of a small isolated community. Cedar Falls had been selected as the test site because of its remote location, manageable population size, and the fact that it could be easily isolated from outside communication and transportation networks. The evacuation had been voluntary in name only. Residents had been offered substantial financial compensation to relocate temporarily while the testing was conducted. Those who refused to leave voluntarily were to be removed by alternative means. According to a timeline in one of the files, the final phase of the evacuation had been scheduled for September 30, 2024. The testing period was expected to last 6 months, after which residents would be allowed to return if they chose to do so. But a handwritten note clipped to the timeline suggested that something had gone wrong. The note dated October 2nd simply read, Phase 3 complications, population recovery not possible. Recommend permanent site abandonment. I spent the rest of that day searching for more information, but the files raised more questions than they answered. What exactly was being tested? What had gone wrong during the evacuation? And why had my parents' death been reported as a car accident rather than part of whatever had happened to the rest of the town? The answer to that last question came when I found their death certificates in a separate file. According to the official documentation, my parents had been killed while attempting to leave Cedar Falls during the evacuation. Their car had gone off the mountain road during what was described as adverse weather conditions, but a handwritten notation in the margin suggested that the accident had occurred while they were fleeing pursuant to Phase 2 protocols. My parents had died trying to escape whatever the Blackwood Project had planned for Cedar Falls. That night, as I sat in my childhood home surrounded by the oppressive silence of an empty town, I began to hear sounds that should not have been possible. Faint voices carried on the mountain wind, speaking words I could not quite make out. The sound of footsteps on gravel streets, though no one was walking anywhere in Cedar Falls. And underneath it all, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if some vast machine was running deep beneath the valley floor. I left Cedar Falls the next morning, driving as fast as I dared on the winding mountain roads. In my rearview mirror, I could see the empty town receding into the distance, swallowed by the morning mist that clung to the valley floor. When I reached the nearest large town and finally got a cellular signal, I tried to contact authorities about what I had discovered. But every agency I called, the RCMP, the provincial government, even federal offices in Ottawa, claimed to have no knowledge of Cedar Falls or any Blackwood project. According to official records, the town of Cedar Falls had never existed. The lawyers who had been handling my parents' estate could not be reached. The phone numbers in their letters had been disconnected, and the address led to an empty office building that showed no signs of recent occupation. Even my parents' death certificates, which I had photographed in the town hall files, could not be verified through any government database. It was as if Cedar Falls and everyone connected to it had been erased from existence. I still have the photographs I took during my stay in the empty town. Though they show nothing unusual, just empty streets and abandoned buildings that could be anywhere. Without context, they prove nothing and explain nothing. Sometimes I drive back toward the mountains, following the route that should lead to Cedar Falls, but I've never been able to find the turnoff that takes you down into the valley. The road signs that once marked the way have been removed, and the mountain highways now seem to bypass the area entirely. 800 people lived in Cedar Falls. I knew their names, their faces, their stories. I grew up with their children, learned from their teachers, bought groceries from their shopkeepers. But according to the world outside that mountain valley, none of them ever existed at all. The mile marker 47 on Highway 83 was supposed to have a 24-hour diner. I have been trying to leave for 3 weeks. I am a long-haul trucker, and I have been driving the interstate highways for over 12 years. In that time, I have stopped at thousands of truck stops, diners, and rest areas across the country. You learn to recognize the good ones from the bad ones, the clean bathrooms from the ones you would rather hold it for another 100 miles, the places where the coffee is strong and the pie is fresh versus the spots where everything tastes like it has been sitting under heat lamps since the Clinton administration. The Crossroads Diner at mile marker 47 on Highway 83 in Nebraska seemed like one of the good ones when I first pulled into its gravel parking lot at 2:17 a.m. on October 15th. The neon sign buzzed cheerfully in the pre-dawn darkness, advertising 24-hour service and world-famous apple pie. My rig needed fuel, and I needed coffee and a decent meal before pushing on to Denver with my load of agricultural equipment. The diner was exactly what you would expect from a small-town Nebraska truck stop. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered linoleum floors, a long counter with chrome stools, and the smell of bacon grease and coffee that never quite leaves places like this. A handful of other drivers occupied booths near the windows, hunched over plates of eggs and hash browns, and a couple of local farmers sat at the counter discussing grain prices with the easy familiarity of men who had been having the same conversation for decades. The waitress who approached my booth was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the efficient movements of someone who had been pouring coffee and taking orders since before I was born. Her name tag read, Dolores. "Coffee, hun?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. "Please, and I would like to see a menu." She filled my cup with coffee that was surprisingly good, strong, and fresh, not the burned swill you often got at places like this. The menu was laminated and sticky, featuring the usual truck stop fare. I ordered the trucker special, 3 eggs over easy, hash browns, bacon, and wheat toast. While I waited for my food, I studied my fellow customers out of habit. Truckers develop a sixth sense about people and places, an ability to read situations that might be dangerous or profitable or just plain interesting. The other drivers looked normal enough, tired men in flannel shirts and baseball caps, working their way through late-night meals before climbing back into their cabs. So at the counter, the two farmers were still discussing crop yields. One was elderly, maybe 70, with hands stained by decades of agricultural work. The other was younger, perhaps in his 40s, with the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. They seemed to know each other well, finishing each other's sentences and sharing the comfortable silence of old friends. My food arrived quickly, and it was better than I had expected. The eggs were cooked perfectly, the bacon was crisp, and the hash browns had the right balance of crispy edges and soft centers. I ate steadily while planning the rest of my route, checking my logbook and calculating arrival times. I finished my meal, paid my check, and returned to my truck around 3:30 a.m. The fuel pumps were modern and efficient, and I was back on the road within 20 minutes, feeling refreshed and ready for the long haul ahead. That should have been the end of my experience with the Crossroads Diner. Just another routine stop on another routine run. But 18 hours later, something went wrong with my route planning software, and I found myself taking a detour through the same stretch of Highway 83. It was 2:17 a.m. when I pulled back into the gravel parking lot at mile marker 47. The scene was identical to the night before. The same neon sign buzzed in the darkness. The same handful of trucks sat in the parking lot, and through the windows I could see the same arrangement of customers in the same booths and counter stools. I walked into the diner, and Dolores approached my booth with the same efficient movements, the same coffee pot in her hand. "Coffee, hun?" she asked. I stared at her for a moment, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. "Have we met before?" She smiled politely. "Not that I recall, hun. First time through this way." I nodded slowly and accepted the coffee, though something felt wrong about the entire interaction. At the counter, the same two farmers were having what appeared to be the exact same conversation about grain prices, using the same words in the same order. I ordered the same meal, partly out of habit, partly to test whether my growing unease was justified. The food arrived at the same pace, cooked to the same specifications, served on the same white ceramic plates. But it was not until I glanced at my watch that real fear began to set in. The time was 2:47 a.m., exactly 30 minutes after I had arrived. The same 30 minutes that had elapsed during my previous visit. I paid my check quickly and hurried back to my truck. The fuel gauge showed that I needed diesel, even though I distinctly remembered filling up the night before. As I pumped fuel, I checked my logbook and GPS system, trying to understand how I had ended up back at the same location after 18 hours of driving. According to my electronic logs, I had never left the diner parking lot. Back on the highway, I drove with increasing urgency, determined to put distance between myself and the Crossroads Diner. I pushed my rig harder than usual, maintaining speeds at the upper limit of safety, stopping only when required by law for rest breaks. But no matter how far I drove or which routes I took, I somehow always found myself approaching mile marker 47 on Highway 83 at exactly 2:17 a.m. By the fourth repetition, I began to experiment with my behavior, hoping to break whatever pattern seemed to be trapping me. I tried ordering different meals, sitting in different booths, engaging the other customers in conversation. But the results were always the same. The farmers discussed grain prices. The other truckers ate their late-night meals in silence. Dolores poured coffee and took orders with mechanical efficiency. And at 3:30 a.m., I would return to my truck, fuel up, and drive away, only to find myself back in the same parking lot 2 hours later. During the seventh repetition, I decided to stay in the diner past 3:30 a.m. to see what would happen. I ordered multiple cups of coffee and engaged Dolores in conversation, asking about her life, her family, the history of the diner. She answered politely but vaguely, as if she was not quite sure of the details herself. At 3:45 a.m., something changed. The other customers began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. Dolores continued to move around the diner, but her actions became repetitive and meaningless, wiping the same section of counter over and over, rearranging the same salt and pepper shakers. By 4 a.m., I was alone in the diner, except for Dolores, who had become completely motionless, standing behind the counter with the coffee pot in her hand, staring at nothing. I tried to leave, but the front door would not open. The windows showed only impenetrable darkness beyond the glass. I was trapped in a fluorescent-lit bubble of reality that existed outside normal time and space. At 4:15 a.m., everything began to reverse. Dolores started moving backward. The other customers rematerialized in their booths, and I found myself walking backward to my truck, watching the scene play out in reverse until the moment when I had first pulled into the parking lot. Then everything reset to 2:17 a.m., and the cycle began again. I have tried everything I can think of to escape. I have attempted to damage the building, to break windows, to prevent other customers from entering. I have tried staying in my truck and refusing to enter the diner. I have tried driving past without stopping. Nothing works. No matter what I do, I always end up sitting in that red vinyl booth at 2:17 a.m. accepting coffee from Dolores and ordering the trucker special. The worst part is not the repetition itself, but the gradual realization that I am not the only one who is trapped. The other customers, the farmers, even Dolores herself, we are all caught in the same endless loop, playing out the same scene over and over again. Sometimes I catch glimpses of awareness in their eyes. Brief moments when the facade slips and I can see the terror and desperation underneath. The elderly farmer will pause mid-sentence, his face showing confusion and fear before the script reasserts itself. One of the other truckers will look around the diner with the expression of a man who knows something is terribly wrong, but cannot quite remember what it is. And Dolores, sweet, efficient Dolores, occasionally stops her routine and stares at me with eyes that hold decades of accumulated horror, as if she remembers every single repetition of our encounter. I have been keeping track of the cycles by making small marks on my logbook, though the marks sometimes disappear when the loop resets. By my count, I have been trapped here for 247 iterations, which would be approximately 3 weeks in normal time. But time has no meaning at mile marker 47. There is only the eternal 2:17 a.m., the eternal cup of coffee, the eternal plate of eggs and bacon that I can taste but never truly consume. I do not know what created this temporal prison, or why we have been chosen to inhabit it. Perhaps it was some kind of accident, a tear in reality that trapped us at the moment of our arrival. Perhaps it was intentional, the work of forces beyond human understanding. What I do know is that the Crossroads Diner continues to advertise 24-hour service to travelers on Highway 83. And somewhere out there, another trucker is calculating fuel stops and arrival times, planning to pull off at mile marker 47 for coffee and a hot meal. If you are reading this, if somehow this message has made it beyond the boundaries of our prison, please heed this warning. Avoid mile marker 47 on Highway 83 in Nebraska. The diner there serves excellent coffee and the pie really is world famous. But once you sit down in those red vinyl booths, once Dolores pours your first cup of coffee, you may find that checking out is not as simple as paying your bill. The Crossroads Diner truly does offer 24-hour service. The problem is that it is the same hour repeated forever and the checkout time never comes. My first week as constable in Drumnadderchit, I found files dating back 30 years. Every missing person case had the same signature and the same cover-up. I had been assigned to the Highland Police Station in Drumnadrich straight out of police college, eager to start my career in law enforcement in the shadow of Loch Ness. The village itself was small and picturesque, the kind of place where tourism thrived on monster legends and Highland charm. I expected my duties to involve little more than directing lost tourists and breaking up the occasional pub fight. Chief Inspector Hamish M'Leod had been running the station for over 25 years. He was a weathered man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that commanded respect from both his officers and the local community. During my first briefing, he emphasized the importance of maintaining good relations with the villagers and handling cases with discretion. Drumnadrich is a quiet place, he told me as we sat in his cluttered office overlooking the main street. We get the odd domestic dispute, some petty theft, tourists who have had too much to drink. Nothing that cannot be sorted with common sense and a gentle hand. The most excitement we see is when someone claims to have spotted Nessie and wants to file an official report. He assigned me to general duties and suggested I spend my first few weeks familiarizing myself with the filing system and case archives. Understanding our history will help you serve the community better, he said, handing me a set of keys to the evidence room. The evidence room was located in the basement of the station, accessed through a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. Fluorescent lights flickered to life as I entered, revealing rows of metal shelving lined with boxes, files, and evidence bags dating back decades. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old paper. I began with recent cases, working my way through routine matters from the past few years. Traffic violations, minor assaults, break-ins, and holiday cottages, exactly what I had expected from a small Highland community. But as I delved deeper into the archives, moving back through the 1990s and into the 1980s, I began to notice something troubling. The missing person reports were unusually frequent for such a small area. Since 1985, there had been 43 cases of people who had disappeared without explanation in or around Drumchet. The pattern was not immediately obvious because the cases were filed separately and occurred over such a long period. But when I created a timeline, the frequency became undeniable. What made the cases even more disturbing was their consistency. The missing individuals were always outsiders, hikers, tourists, researchers, or temporary workers who had no deep roots in the community. They were people who might not be immediately missed, whose disappearances could be attributed to accidents in the challenging Highland terrain. It was the signatures on the case reports that made my blood run cold. Every single file bore the signature of Chief Inspector Hamish M'Leod. For 37 years, he had been the investigating officer on every missing person case in the area. More troubling still, every investigation had been closed within a week, usually with the conclusion that the missing person had left the area voluntarily or had suffered an accident in the wilderness. I pulled several files for closer examination. The case of Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a marine biologist from Edinburgh University who had come to Loch Ness in 1987 to conduct research on local fish populations. She had been staying at a bed and breakfast in the village and had told the owners she planned to spend several days collecting samples along the shoreline. When she failed to return after 3 days, the owners contacted police. According to M'Leod's report, Dr. Sinclair had packed her belongings and left the village without notice, apparently having abandoned her research project. But attached to the file were witness statements from several villagers who claimed to have seen her equipment and personal belongings being loaded into a police van in the middle of the night. The case of James Morrison, a freelance journalist from Glasgow who had come to Drumnadrich in 1993 to write an article about Highland tourism. Morrison had been asking questions about local legends and folklore, particularly stories that did not involve the Loch Ness Monster. According to his editor at the Glasgow Herald, Morrison had called the newsroom the evening before his disappearance, claiming he had uncovered evidence of something significant that would make a major story. Mloud's investigation concluded that Morrison had returned to Glasgow without informing anyone, but his car was found abandoned on a forestry track 3 mi from the village. The keys were still in the ignition and his notebook was missing. The case of Sarah Chen, a geology graduate student from Cambridge who had been studying rock formations around Loch Ness in 1999. Chen had been methodical in her research, documenting everything and maintaining regular contact with her supervisor. When she disappeared, her camping equipment was found neatly packed at her campsite, but her research notes and geological samples were gone. Each file followed the same pattern: initial concern from friends, family, or employers. A brief investigation by Mloud, the discovery that the missing person had apparently left voluntarily or had suffered an unexplained accident. Case closed, but the witness statements buried deep in the files told a different story. Villagers reporting seeing police vehicles in areas where the missing persons had last been spotted. Accounts of lights and activity at the old quarry outside town during the nights when people disappeared. Strange sounds coming from the direction of the police station after midnight. I was still processing these discoveries when I found the file that changed everything. It was labeled simply Operational Guidelines Restricted Access. Inside were typed instructions apparently distributed to all officers at the station outlining procedures for handling what were termed Category 7 incidents. The language was bureaucratic and euphemistic, but the meaning was clear. Category 7 incidents involved civilian interference with classified operations in the designated security zone. Such incidents were to be reported immediately to the chief inspector, who would coordinate with external authorities to ensure appropriate resolution with minimal community impact. The guidelines included detailed instructions for evidence disposal, witness statement modification, and coordination with specialist personnel from regional command. Most chilling of all was a section on population management protocols that outlined methods for identifying and monitoring individuals who might pose a security risk. Attached to the guidelines was a letter from the Scottish office dated authorizing the establishment of a restricted research facility in the area around Loch Ness. The letter was heavily redacted, but it was clear that the facility was conducting classified government research and that local law enforcement had been tasked with maintaining security and preventing civilian interference. I photographed the documents with my phone, though I was not sure who I could trust with the information. If Mloud had been covering up disappearances for over 3 decades, the corruption clearly extended beyond the local station. That evening, I attempted to research the missing individuals online, hoping to find some trace of them in the years following their disappearances. What I found was even more disturbing than their initial vanishing. None of them existed in any official records after the dates of their disappearances. No employment records, no tax filings, no medical records, no social media presence. It was as if they had been systematically erased from all databases and documentation. Dr. Sinclair's research had been scrubbed from Edinburgh University's records. Her published papers had been removed from academic databases. Even her birth certificate seemed to have vanished from government archives. James Morrison's articles had been deleted from the Glasgow Herald's digital archives. His byline no longer appeared in any searches of Scottish journalism databases. Sarah Chen's graduate records at Cambridge University showed no trace of her existence. Her thesis project had apparently never been registered, and her supervisor claimed no knowledge of any graduate student by that name. 43 people had been professionally and completely erased from all official existence. The next morning I confronted Mloud in his office, though I was careful not to reveal the full extent of what I had discovered. I mentioned finding some inconsistencies in old missing person files and asked for clarification on procedures. His reaction was immediate and telling. The easygoing demeanor vanished, replaced by cold calculation. He asked specific questions about which files I had accessed and what exactly I had seen. When I gave vague answers, his questions became more pointed and threatening. "Young Campbell," he said, leaning back in his chair, "some things are better left undisturbed. This is a quiet community that values its privacy and peace. People who cannot respect that sometimes find Highland life is not suited to them." The threat was clear, but I was not prepared to become the 44th person to disappear in Drumchet. That night, I copied all the relevant files and mailed them to a journalist contact in Edinburgh along with a detailed letter explaining my discoveries. I also sent copies to the Independent Police Complaints Commission and the Scottish Parliament's Justice Committee. Then I submitted my resignation and left Drumnadroshed before dawn, driving straight to Edinburgh without stopping. The investigation that followed revealed the existence of a classified research facility hidden in the hills above Loch Ness, operated jointly by the Ministry of Defence and an unnamed private contractor. The facility had been conducting experiments that required absolute secrecy, and local law enforcement had been tasked with eliminating any potential security breaches. Mloud and 3 other officers were arrested and charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. The research facility was closed, though the government refused to reveal the nature of the experiments that had been conducted there. 43 families finally received answers about their missing loved ones, though the bodies were never recovered. The official inquiry concluded that the victims had been processed according to national security protocols, and that their remains had been disposed of in accordance with classified procedures. I never returned to police work. The experience in Drumnadroshed had shown me that sometimes the people sworn to protect and serve are the ones you most need protection from. But sometimes on quiet Highland evenings, I still wonder what they were really doing in that hidden facility above Loch Ness. And I wonder how many other small communities across Scotland are hiding similar secrets beneath their picturesque surfaces. The monster in Loch Ness may be a myth, but the monsters wearing police uniforms were terrifyingly real. I inherited my great-uncle's lighthouse thinking it would be peaceful. The logbook entries from 1892 told a different story. When Uncle Angus died at the age of 93, I was surprised to learn he had left me his lighthouse on Devil's Point, a rocky outcropping on the Nova Scotia coast about 40 kilometers southeast of Halifax. I had visited the lighthouse only twice as a child. Both times during brief family reunions where Uncle Angus had seemed more interested in his solitude than in entertaining relatives. The lighthouse had been decommissioned by the Coast Guard in 1987, but Uncle Angus had purchased the property from the government and continued living in the keeper's quarters. He made his living as a freelance marine electrician, servicing fishing boats and pleasure craft throughout the region. By all accounts, he was content with his isolated existence on the windswept point. I was working as a software engineer in Toronto when the lawyer's letter arrived informing me of my inheritance. My life had become increasingly stressful. Long hours, demanding clients, and the constant pressure of urban living. The idea of owning a lighthouse, even a defunct one, appealed to my romantic notions about simpler living. I took a week's vacation and drove out to Nova Scotia to inspect the property and decide whether to sell it or perhaps use it as a weekend retreat. The drive from Halifax took me through small fishing villages and along winding coastal roads that offered spectacular views of the Atlantic. As I approached Devil's Point, however, the landscape became more desolate and forbidding. The lighthouse stood 70 ft tall, its white-painted tower visible for miles against the gray autumn sky. The keeper's quarters at the base were a modest 2-story structure with weathered shingles and windows that faced the sea. A small outbuilding served as a workshop and storage area. The entire property was surrounded by granite cliffs that dropped sharply to the ocean below. Uncle Angus had maintained the buildings well. The lighthouse tower was in excellent condition, and the quarters were clean and comfortable if spartanly furnished. The kitchen was equipped with modern appliances, and a satellite dish provided internet connectivity. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could live comfortably while remaining completely isolated from the world. I spent my first few days exploring the property and going through Uncle Angus's belongings. Most of his personal effects were unremarkable. Books on marine engineering, nautical charts, correspondence with clients. But in a locked cabinet in his study, I found a collection of lighthouse logbooks dating back to 1847, when the light station had first become operational. The early entries were routine records of weather conditions, ship sightings, and maintenance activities. But as I read deeper into the logs, I began to notice references to events that seemed unusual for a typical lighthouse station. The logbook for 1892, kept by lighthouse keeper Malcolm Fraser, contained the first entries that made me uneasy. October 15, 1892, thick fog persisted for 3 days. During the night watch, heard voices calling from the water below. Investigated with lantern but found no vessel in distress. The voices continued until dawn. October 18, 1892. Clear night, calm seas. At approximately 2 a.m., observed lights moving beneath the water near the eastern rocks. Lights appeared to be in formation as if carried by men walking on the ocean floor. Phenomenon lasted nearly an hour before disappearing toward deeper water. October 22, 1892. Found strange objects washed ashore this morning. Pieces of carved bone and what appeared to be clothing made from fish scales. Items have been stored in the shed pending investigation by authorities. October 25, 1892. No response from Halifax to my reports of unusual phenomena, beginning to question my own observations. Wife suggests the isolation is affecting my mind. The entries continued in this vein for several more weeks before abruptly stopping in November 1, 1892. The next entry was dated January 1893 and written in different handwriting, apparently by Fraser's replacement. There was no explanation for what had happened to Fraser or why he had abandoned his post. I found similar patterns in logbooks from other years. Keepers would begin reporting strange phenomena: lights beneath the water, voices from the sea, unusual objects washing ashore before either stopping their entries entirely or being replaced by new personnel. The average tenure for lighthouse keepers at Devil's Point was less than 2 years, unusually short for what should have been a stable position. The most detailed account came from the 1923 logbook, kept by a keeper named Robert Sinclair, September 3, 1923. During tonight's watch, witnessed approximately 20 figures emerging from the water near the base of the cliffs. Figures appeared human in shape, but moved in ways that suggested they were not entirely human. They gathered objects from the shoreline before returning to the sea. September 5, 1923. The figures returned again tonight, observed them more closely through field glasses. Their skin appeared to have a scaled texture, and their movements were fluid and unnatural. They seemed to be constructing something from driftwood and stones at the waterline. September 10th, 1923. The construction is complete. It appears to be some form of altar or ceremonial platform. The figures gather there each night, engaging in activities I cannot fully comprehend from this distance. Their voices carry on the wind, speaking in a language I do not recognize. September 15, 1923, I've made a terrible mistake. Tonight I descended to the shore to investigate the structure more closely. The figures were waiting for me. They did not harm me, but they communicated somehow without speaking. I now understand that they have been here far longer than the lighthouse, far longer than human settlement on this coast. We are the intruders. September 20th, 1923. They have made me an offer. They will allow me to remain as lighthouse keeper to continue my duties, but I must also serve as their guardian. I must ensure that others do not interfere with their activities. I must protect their secret. September 25th, 1923, I have accepted their terms. God help me, I have accepted. The alternative was to join Fraser and the others who refused their offer. I have seen what lies beneath the platform they built. I will not end up there. The final entry in Sinclair's log was dated October 31st, 1923. The bargain is sealed. Future keepers will understand their responsibilities when the time comes. The lighthouse will continue to guide ships safely to harbor, but it serves another purpose as well. We are the guardians of something ancient and terrible, something that must never be disturbed. I closed the logbook with trembling hands, trying to process what I had read. These accounts read like the fantasies of isolated men driven to madness by solitude and harsh conditions. But the consistency of the reports across different time periods and different keepers suggested something more disturbing. That evening, as I sat in Uncle Angus's study trying to rationalize what I had discovered, I found a modern notebook hidden behind the historical logbooks. It was Uncle Angus's personal journal, and the most recent entries were dated just weeks before his death. They are becoming more active as my time grows short. They know I am dying, and they are concerned about who will replace me. I have tried to explain that the lighthouse is no longer operational, that there is no need for a keeper, but they do not understand. They have kept their bargain for over a century, and they expect the same from us. I hoped the lighthouse would be sold to the government or demolished after my death, but Storm has inherited it. He is a good boy, but he does not understand what he has inherited along with the property. I pray he will be wiser than I was. I pray he will sell the lighthouse and leave this place forever. But I fear they will not allow him to leave. They need a guardian, and they have been waiting patiently for the succession. Tonight I will try to warn him, but I doubt my letter will be enough. Some knowledge can only be learned through experience. The journal entries explained much about Uncle Angus's long isolation and his reluctance to maintain family relationships. He had spent over 40 years as the guardian of whatever ancient presence haunted Devil's Point, protecting their secret while living in constant fear of what they might do if he failed in his duties. As I sat reading by lamplight, I began to hear the sounds Sinclair and Fraser had described. Voices carried on the ocean wind, speaking in a language that seemed familiar yet completely alien. When I looked out the window facing the sea, I could see lights moving beneath the water, just as the old logbooks had described. I spent that night huddled in the study, afraid to venture outside or even approach the windows. As dawn broke, the phenomena ceased, but I knew they would return with the darkness. Over the following days, I found physical evidence that corroborated the logbook accounts. The stone platform Sinclair had described was still there, partially concealed by seaweed and barnacles, but clearly artificial. Strange objects continued to wash ashore. Carved bones, scales that seemed too large to come from any known fish, fragments of material that looked like clothing but felt unlike any fabric I had ever encountered. On my fourth night at the lighthouse, they came for me. I was awakened around 2:00 a.m. by a sound like fingernails scraping against glass. When I looked out the bedroom window, I saw them climbing up the cliff face. Dozens of figures that moved with fluid, inhuman grace. In the moonlight, I could see that Sinclair's description had been accurate. They appeared humanoid, but were clearly something else entirely. They surrounded the lighthouse but did not attempt to enter. Instead, they waited with the patience of creatures who had existed for centuries and could wait centuries more. Their leader, if such terms applied to their organization, approached the door and spoke in accented but clearly understandable English. "You are the new guardian. You will continue the compact as your uncle did, as those before him did. The lighthouse guides ships from the rocks above. We guide souls from the depths. Below, both services are necessary. The voice was like the sound of waves over shingle, inhuman but compelling. I found myself walking toward the door despite every instinct telling me to barricade myself inside. What happened to the others? The keepers who refused? They serve in other ways. The sea has many needs. Through the window I could see the ocean glowing with phosphorescent light and shapes moving beneath the surface that were far too large to be whales. I understood then why Uncle Angus had lived alone for so many decades, why the lighthouse keepers before him had either fled or disappeared. The choice was simple. Serve as their guardian willingly or serve them in death. I made the same bargain that Sinclair had made, that Uncle Angus had made, that generations of keepers had made before them. I would maintain their secret, protect their ancient ceremonies, and ensure that no one disturbed the waters around Devil's Point. In return, I would be allowed to live, to continue my human existence while serving as intermediary between their world and ours. That was 6 months ago. I have not returned to Toronto or my former life. I tell people I am taking an extended sabbatical working on a novel, enjoying the simple life by the sea. They do not need to know the truth. The lighthouse beam still sweeps across the water each night, though no ships depend on its guidance anymore. But it serves another purpose now, as it has for over a century. It marks the boundary between the world of the living and something far older and stranger. If you ever find yourself driving along the Nova Scotia coast and see the lighthouse on Devil's Point, keep driving. Do not stop to explore. Do not venture down to the shoreline, and do not ask the locals about the lights beneath the water. Some guardians protect treasure. Others guard secrets. I guard something that should never be disturbed, something that has existed in these waters since long before humans first set foot on this continent. The sea keeps its own counsel, and some bargains once made can never be broken. When Millfield Textiles closed overnight, leaving 200 people unemployed, I thought it was just another corporate casualty. The truth was far more sinister. I have been working as an investigative journalist for the Youngstown Tribune for 8 years, covering the steady decline of manufacturing in northeastern Ohio. Factory closures had become so routine that they barely made the front page anymore. Another business moving operations overseas. Another community losing its economic foundation. Another collection of empty buildings added to the Rust Belt landscape. But the closure of Millfield Textiles was different. The factory had been operating in the small town of Millfield for over 60 years, employing nearly 200 workers in a community of just 800 residents. It was the kind of place where 3 generations of the same family might work on the same production line, where the factory whistle marked the rhythm of daily life for the entire town. On Monday morning, October 12, 2023, workers arrived for their 6 a.m. shift to find the factory gates chained shut and a handwritten notice taped to the fence. Millfield Textiles has ceased operations effective immediately. All employees should contact the state unemployment office for assistance. No warning, no severance packages, no explanation beyond that single typewritten sentence. The Tribune assigned me to cover the story, expecting a standard piece about economic hardship and corporate callousness. I drove to Millfield thinking I would interview some displaced workers, get a quote from the mayor about seeking new industries, and file 1,000 words about another small-town casualty of globalization. What I found instead was a community in the grip of something approaching panic. My first stop was Murphy's Diner on Main Street, the kind of place where local workers gathered for coffee before their shifts and beers after work. On a Tuesday morning, it should have been busy with unemployed factory workers drowning their sorrows and planning their next moves. Instead, I found the diner nearly empty except for a few elderly retirees nursing coffee and speaking in hushed tones. The owner, Janet Murphy, was a woman in her 50s who had run the diner for over 20 years. She knew every factory worker by name and had served as an informal community center for decades. But when I introduced myself as a journalist and asked about the factory closure, her demeanor changed immediately. "Nothing to say about it," she said, avoiding eye contact while wiping down a counter that was already clean. "These things happen. People move on." I pressed for more information, but Janet became increasingly uncomfortable, eventually retreating to the kitchen and leaving me alone with my coffee and unanswered questions. The reaction was the same everywhere I went. Workers who should have been angry and vocal about their sudden unemployment were strangely silent. When I knocked on doors in the neighborhoods where factory employees lived, I was met with nervous denials and quickly closed doors. At the unemployment office in the county seat, I spoke with Maria Santos, a caseworker who had been processing claims from Millfield workers. According to her records, only 37 people had filed for unemployment benefits, less than 20% of the facto's workforce. "That is unusual," Maria admitted when I pointed out the discrepancy. "Usually, when a large employer closes, we are swamped with applications." But most of the Millfield workers told me they had already found other employment or were planning to relocate. But when I checked with neighboring factories and businesses, none reported hiring significant numbers of former Millfield employees. The workers seemed to have simply vanished. My breakthrough came when I located Tommy Reeves, a 24-year-old who had worked at Millfield for 3 years before the closure. Unlike the other workers I had approached, Tommy was willing to talk, though only after I agreed to meet him at a truck stop 20 meters outside town. Tommy was clearly frightened when he sat down across from me in a corner booth of the truck stop restaurant. He kept glancing toward the parking lot and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You do not understand what you're getting into," he said. "This is not just about some factory closing. People who ask too many questions about Millfield textiles have a way of disappearing." According to Tommy, the factory had not been engaged in normal textile production for at least 5 years. While the front portion of the building continued to manufacture clothing and fabric, the back sections had been converted into something else entirely. "They brought in new equipment around 2018, Tommy explained. "Big machines, stuff I had never seen before. They hired new supervisors, people from outside who did not talk to the regular workers. And they started requiring security clearances for anyone who worked in the back sections." Tommy had been curious about the changes and had tried to get a glimpse of the restricted areas during his breaks. What he saw convinced him that Millfield Textiles was involved in something far more dangerous than clothing production. "Chemical processing," he said. "Barrels and barrels of chemicals being brought in at night, workers in hazmat suits, and the smell. This sweet chemical smell that would make you dizzy if you got too close." But it was not until the final week of operation that Tommy understood the true horror of what was happening at Millfield Textiles. They were not just processing chemicals, he said, his voice dropping even lower. They were processing people. According to Tommy's account, the factory had been serving as a disposal facility for human remains, using industrial equipment to dissolve bodies and process the resulting material into chemical compounds that could be safely discarded or even sold to other industries. The operation had been running smoothly for years, handling clients from organized crime operations throughout the Midwest. Bodies would arrive at night in refrigerated trucks, be processed through the industrial equipment, and emerge as anonymous chemical waste. But something had gone wrong during the final week of operation. An equipment malfunction had released toxic fumes throughout the factory, exposing workers to concentrated doses of the chemicals used in the body processing operation. 12 people died that night, Tommy said, just collapsed at their workstations, choking on that sweet chemical smell. The company covered it up, said it was carbon monoxide from a faulty heating system. But I saw the bodies before they took them away. That was not carbon monoxide poisoning. The mass casualty event had forced the immediate closure of the facility. Workers who had been exposed to the fumes but survived were offered substantial payments in exchange for their silence and immediate relocation out of the area. Those who refused the offer faced more direct consequences. My supervisor, Jim Hartley, said he was going to the EPA about what he had seen, Tommy explained. 3 days later, his house burned down with him inside. The fire department said it was an electrical fault, but Jim's wife swore she smelled that same sweet chemical smell around the house the night before the fire. Tommy had taken the company's relocation offer and moved to Cleveland, but he remained terrified that speaking to me would result in retaliation. As our conversation ended, he made me promise not to use his real name and begged me not to try to contact him again. Despite Tommy's warnings, I was determined to investigate further. I began researching the corporate structure behind Millfield Textiles and discovered a complex web of shell companies and offshore holdings that eventually led to a subsidiary of a major chemical processing corporation with government contracts. Public records showed that the facility had received several visits from EPA inspectors over the years, but all the inspection reports had been classified or heavily redacted. The few details that remained visible suggested violations of hazardous waste regulations, but no enforcement actions had ever been taken. My investigation took a disturbing turn when I tried to locate other former Millfield employees. Of the 200 people who had worked at the factory, I could only find contact information for about 50. The others seemed to have vanished completely. No forwarding addresses, no employment records at other companies, no social media presence. At the Millfield Town Hall, I requested records related to the factory's operations and closure. Mayor Patricia Williams, a nervous woman in her 60s, initially claimed that all such records had been destroyed in a routine document purge. But under pressure, she admitted that the town had signed a non-disclosure agreement with Millfield Textiles' parent company in exchange for a substantial cash payment. The company said there could be lawsuits if word got out about the closure, Mayor Williams explained. They offered to pay off the town's debt and fund improvements to our infrastructure if we agreed to keep quiet about their operations. What were we supposed to do? We needed that money. The non-disclosure agreement covered not just the factory's closure, but any information about its operations, employee roster, or the circumstances surrounding the final week of production. Town officials who violated the agreement faced financial penalties that could bankrupt the municipal government. Armed with this information, I attempted to locate the factory building itself, hoping to find physical evidence of the alleged body processing operation. But when I drove to the industrial park where Millfield Textiles had been located, I found only an empty lot covered in fresh concrete. According to the site manager, the building had been demolished less than 2 weeks after the factory's closure. The demolition had been conducted at night by a crew from out of state, and all the resulting debris had been hauled away to an undisclosed location. Fastest demolition I ever saw. The site manager told me, "Usually takes months to get permits and plan a job that size. But these guys had all their paperwork in order and worked around the clock until the whole place was gone." The demolition had been so thorough that even the building's foundations had been removed and the entire site had been covered with several feet of new concrete. It was as if the factory had never existed. My editor at the Tribune was initially supportive of the investigation, but his enthusiasm cooled rapidly as I uncovered more disturbing information. When I submitted my story detailing the allegations about body processing and worker deaths, he refused to publish it. "You do not have enough solid evidence," he explained during a tense meeting in his office. "This is all based on the word of one scared factory worker and a lot of speculation. We could face massive lawsuits if we publish this without more proof." But I suspected the real reason for his reluctance became clear when the Tribune's parent company announced a significant advertising contract with the chemical corporation that owned Millfield Textiles. My story was killed and I was reassigned to cover municipal government meetings and school board elections. Frustrated but not defeated, I attempted to interest other news outlets in the story. But every journalist I contacted cited the same concerns about insufficient evidence and legal liability. The few who showed initial interest quickly backed away after making preliminary inquiries. It became clear that the cover-up extended far beyond Millfield's town limits. The chemical corporation had the resources and connections to suppress any investigation that might expose their illegal operations. 6 months after the factory's closure, I made one final trip to Millfield to check on the community's recovery. What I found was deeply unsettling. The town appeared to be thriving in ways that seemed impossible for a community that had just lost its major employer. New businesses had opened on Main Street. Houses were being renovated. The municipal building had been completely refurbished. Everyone I spoke with claimed that the factory's closure had been a blessing in disguise that allowed the community to diversify its economy. But beneath the surface prosperity, I sensed the same fear I had encountered during my initial investigation. Conversations would stop when I approached. People avoided making eye contact, and several longtime residents mentioned that they were planning to move away from Millfield as soon as possible. At Murphy's Diner, Janet Murphy served me coffee with shaking hands and refused to discuss anything beyond the weather. But as I was leaving, she slipped me a folded piece of paper with an address written in careful handwriting. The address led me to a small cemetery on the outskirts of town where I found a section of fresh graves dating from October 2023. 12 graves in total, each marked with a simple headstone bearing only a name and date of death. All the death dates were within a 3-day period during the final week of Millfield Textiles' operation. According to the cemetery records, all 12 individuals had died of industrial accidents and had been buried at the expense of an anonymous benefactor. But the funeral director, an elderly man named Harold Welsh, was willing to share more details off the record. "Strangest thing I ever saw," he told me in the privacy of his office. Bodies came in sealed coffins with instructions not to open them for viewing. Families were told there had been extensive injuries that made viewings impossible. But when I moved the coffins, they felt too light, like they were mostly empty. Harold suspected that the coffins contained only partial remains, if anything at all. The real bodies, he believed, had been processed through the factory's industrial equipment and disposed of as chemical waste. The story I have just told you will never see print in any mainstream publication. The evidence is too circumstantial, the legal risks too great, and the corporate interests too powerful. Tommy Reeves has not responded to my attempts to contact him, and I fear he may have joined the ranks of those who have permanently disappeared. But the truth about Millfield Textiles needs to be told, even if only in forums like this where it can be dismissed as speculation or conspiracy theory. Somewhere in Ohio, there is an empty concrete lot where 200 people once worked and where at least 12 people died. Horrible deaths. The families of those victims deserve to know what really happened during those final days of operation. And somewhere there are corporate executives and government officials who know exactly what went on at that factory and have chosen to cover it up rather than face the legal and financial consequences of their actions. The town of Millfield may have received enough money to renovate their municipal building and attract new businesses. But no amount of money can wash the blood from that concrete lot or silence the voices of those who died because profit was more important than human life. I was sent to conduct a population census in Ravens Hollow. According to my count, there were 1,247 residents. According to their birth and death records, that should have been impossible. I have worked for the Office for National Statistics for 12 years, conducting population surveys and demographic studies across northern England. Most assignments are routine, traveling to designated areas, knocking on doors, recording household information, and compiling data for government planning purposes. It is methodical work that requires attention to detail and infinite patience with residents who view any government inquiry with suspicion. The assignment to Ravens Hollow came in late September 2023, part of a special census project intended to update population records in remote communities that had been missed during the standard 10-year census. The village was located in the Yorkshire Dales, about 30 kilometers from the nearest market town, accessible only by a single-track road that wound through moorland and sheep pastures. My briefing materials indicated that Ravens Hollow had last been officially counted in 1891 when the population was recorded as 423 residents. Local government records suggested the current population was probably around 300 people, mostly farmers and retirees who had chosen rural isolation over urban conveniences. I arrived in Ravens Hollow on a gray October morning, driving a government van loaded with forms, clipboards, and electronic tablets for data collection. The village appeared exactly as I had expected. A cluster of stone cottages arranged around a small green with a few shops, a pub, and a Norman church that had probably stood there for 800 years. What struck me immediately was how busy the village seemed for such a remote location. People walked along the narrow streets, tended gardens, chatted in small groups outside the post office. Children played on the village green while their parents watched from wooden benches. It was a picture of rural vitality that contradicted my assumptions about declining populations in isolated communities. I established my temporary office in a room above the Crown and Anchor pub rented from the landlord for the duration of my stay. The room came with a desk, telephone, and filing cabinet. Everything I needed to organize my census work over what I estimated would be a 2-week period. The actual door-to-door counting began the next morning. I started with the cottages nearest the village center, following standard procedures for introducing myself, explaining the purpose of the census, and requesting basic household information. The residents were uniformly cooperative and friendly, more so than in most communities I had surveyed. But as I worked my way through the village, I began to notice inconsistencies that troubled my methodical mind. Many of the residents appeared far younger than their stated ages. A woman who claimed to be 75 had the appearance and vigor of someone 20 years younger. A man who said he had lived in the village for 60 years looked to be in his early 40s. When I mentioned these observations tactfully, residents would laugh and credit the healthy Yorkshire air or good genetics. More disturbing were the families with unusually large numbers of children. Household after household contained 6, 8, or even 10 children, all healthy and well cared for, but far more than the national average for rural communities. When I asked about school arrangements, parents mentioned a local school that I had not seen during my initial survey of the village. By the end of my first week, I had counted 1,947 residents living in 312 households. This was more than 4 times the expected population for a village of Ravens Hollow's apparent size. Either my briefing materials were drastically inaccurate, or something very unusual was happening in this remote Yorkshire community. I decided to conduct a more systematic investigation, beginning with the village's official records. At the local council office, a small building that also housed the post office and library, I requested access to birth and death registers, property records, and historical population data. The council clerk, a pleasant woman in her 50s named Margaret Whitby, was initially helpful but became evasive when I asked specific questions about population growth and demographic trends. "We have always been a close-knit community," she explained, avoiding direct answers about birth rates or family sizes. People here tend to have large families and live long lives. It is just the way things are. But when I examined the actual registers, I discovered statistical impossibilities that challenged everything I understood about population dynamics. According to the birth records, Ravens Hollow had experienced a consistent birth rate of approximately 60 children per year for the past 3 decades. This was remarkable enough for a community that supposedly contained only 300 people. But the death records showed only 12 deaths during the same 30-year period. Even accounting for residents moving away, these numbers suggested a population growth rate that was demographically impossible. No community, especially an isolated rural village, could sustain such explosive population growth without massive immigration from outside areas. When I pointed out these inconsistencies to Mrs. Whitby, she became defensive and then suspicious. I am not sure what you are implying, Mr. Pierce, but our records are accurate and complete. Perhaps your government databases are out of date. That evening at the Crown and Anchor, I attempted to discuss my findings with other residents. The pub was crowded with locals, families sharing meals and conversation in the warm atmosphere of rural hospitality. But when I mentioned population statistics or demographic trends, conversations would halt abruptly or change. Direction, the landlord, a man named Thomas Hargreaves, who claimed to have run the pub for 40 years despite appearing to be in his 30s, was particularly evasive. Census work must be fascinating, he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. All those numbers and calculations, but I expect you will find everything in order here in Ravens Hollow. We are a very ordinary village. Over the next few days, I began to notice other anomalies that suggested Ravens Hollow was anything but ordinary. The village shops were surprisingly well stocked for such a remote location, with fresh produce and specialty items that would normally require daily deliveries from suppliers in larger towns. When I asked about supply chains and distribution networks, shopkeepers gave vague answers about local arrangements and community cooperation. The school that parents had mentioned was indeed real, but it was far larger than necessary for the number of children I had counted. The building could accommodate at least 400 students with modern facilities and equipment that seemed incongruous in a traditional Yorkshire village. Most puzzling of all were the new housing developments I discovered on the outskirts of the village. Entire streets of modern homes designed to blend with the traditional architecture but clearly built within the past few years. According to planning records at the council office, no construction permits had been issued for residential development. When I mentioned these developments to residents, they seemed genuinely confused, as if they had never noticed the dozens of new houses that had somehow appeared without anyone remarking on them. My investigation took a more disturbing turn when I attempted to verify the identities of some residents using national databases. Many of the people I had interviewed simply did not exist in government records. No national insurance numbers, no tax records, no medical registrations, no electoral rolls. It was as if entire families had materialized in Ravens Hollow without ever having lived anywhere else or participated in any aspect of modern British society. The breakthrough came when I discovered a locked filing cabinet in the council office basement, accessed during an evening when I had stayed late to work on my reports. Inside were documents that revealed the true nature of Ravens Hollow's population explosion. The village was part of a classified government program called Project Continuity, designed to test demographic manipulation techniques and population control methods. According to the files, Ravens Hollow had been selected as an experimental community where birth rates, aging processes, and social structures could be artificially manipulated using advanced biotechnology and psychological conditioning. The residents were not growing older at normal rates because they were receiving experimental treatments that dramatically slowed the aging process. The unusually high birth rates were the result of fertility enhancement programs that ensured most families produced large numbers of children. The lack of deaths was explained by medical interventions that prevented natural mortality. But the most horrifying revelation was the purpose behind these experiments. Project Continuity was preparing for demographic warfare, the ability to rapidly expand or contract populations in targeted areas for strategic advantage. Ravens Hollow was a proving ground for techniques that could be deployed against enemy populations or used to rapidly colonize contested territories. The residents themselves were unaware of their participation in the program. They had been conditioned to accept their enhanced longevity and fertility as natural characteristics of their community. Regular psychological treatments administered through the water supply and during routine medical examinations ensured compliance and prevented questioning of obviously abnormal circumstances. The documents indicated that similar experimental communities existed throughout the United Kingdom, each testing different aspects of demographic manipulation. Ravens Hollow was just one node in a network of secret research facilities disguised as ordinary villages and towns. As I photographed the classified documents, I heard footsteps on the stairs above. I quickly replaced the files and attempted to leave the building, but found the exits had been locked from the outside. I was trapped in the council office with evidence of a government conspiracy that officially did not exist. The next morning, I was discovered by Mrs. Whitby, who claimed to be concerned when she noticed lights in the building overnight. She accepted my explanation about working late on census reports, but I could see suspicion in her eyes. Over the following days, my interactions with residents became increasingly strained. People who had previously been friendly and cooperative now watched me with undisguised weariness. Children stopped playing when I approached. Adults found excuses to end conversations abruptly. It became clear that my investigation had been discovered and that the community was closing ranks against the threat I represented to their secret. On my final morning in Ravens Hollow, I attempted to leave the village with my census data and the photographic evidence I had gathered. But when I reached my van, I found that the engine had been sabotaged and my official documents had been replaced with fabricated records showing a population count of 287 residents. Mrs. Whitby arrived shortly afterward with several other villagers, ostensibly to help with my departure. "I am afraid there has been some confusion about your assignment," she said with artificial concern. "According to our records, you were never authorized to conduct a census in Ravens Hollow. In fact, there is no record of any government survey being scheduled for this area." She handed me a letter on official office for National Statistics letterhead stating that my assignment had been canceled and that I was to return immediately to headquarters without filing any reports about Ravens Hollow. The letter bore the signature of my supervisor, but I had never seen the document before and was certain it was a forgery. A replacement van arrived within the hour, driven by a man who claimed to be from the ONS motor pool but whom I had never seen before. My original van was towed away, ostensibly for repairs, but I suspected it would be thoroughly searched and any remaining evidence would be destroyed. During the drive back to Leeds, the replacement driver made casual conversation about my canceled assignment and my plans for upcoming projects, but his questions were too specific, too focused on what I might have discovered during my time in Ravens Hollow. When I arrived at ONS headquarters, I found that my desk had been cleared and my computer access had been revoked. My supervisor informed me that I was being transferred to a different department, one that handled routine data entry rather than field surveys. "Budget cuts," he explained with transparent insincerity. "We need to reorganize our field operations and focus on more efficient data collection methods." My personnel file had been altered to indicate that I had requested the transfer due to health concerns related to travel and stress. When I protested that I had made no such request, I was referred to occupational health services and recommended for psychological evaluation. The message was clear. My discoveries in Ravens Hollow would be dismissed as stress-related delusions, and any attempts to publicize them would be attributed to mental instability. I left government service shortly afterward, officially citing personal reasons, but actually because I could no longer trust the organization I had served for over a decade. The census data I had collected in Ravens Hollow disappeared from all official records, and the village itself was removed from government databases as if it had never existed. But I remember the 1,147 residents I counted during those 2 weeks. In October 2023, I remember their faces, their names, their impossible vitality and unnatural longevity. Somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales, they continue to live their artificially enhanced lives, unaware that they are test subjects in an experiment that could reshape the demographic future of humanity. The census I conducted in Ravens Hollow was supposed to last 2 weeks. In truth, it will never end because the questions it raised about population control, government experimentation, and demographic warfare will haunt me for the rest of my natural life. And sometimes late at night I wonder how many other villages across Britain are hiding similar secrets, and how many other government workers have stumbled upon projects they were never meant to discover.